All right, and we will stick with the theme of youthfulness and education with our next panel, which is about school choice. So I will invite Michelle Wirth, the Director of Communications for the Georgia Charter Schools Association, up here, and the other panelists whom she will introduce. So, Michelle, come on up.
Good morning. We're here to discuss school choice and ways to fund education that can ensure that all Georgia families have access to educational options that are the best fit for their children. These options can put students and our state on the pathway to success. And we have a very knowledgeable panel here assembled today. We have, okay, they're still discussing. Okay, we have Hannah Heck, attorney and board chair of Georgia Charter Schools Association and Westside Atlanta Charter School. We have Mike Dudgeon, Policy Director for Lieutenant Governor Geoff Duncan and a former state representative. And we have Bill Mattox, Director of the J. Stanley Marshall Center for Educational Options at the James Madison Institute in Florida. So we're going to start off by talking about charter schools. Hannah, why are public charter schools beneficial for families and communities?
Good morning. So, number of things. I think the big one would be choice, and that's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but as a practical matter, what it means is choices for families. There's a lot of reasons why families need another option. It might be some specifics around their student and how they learn, and it may be that their zoned public school is not a great learning environment. And so in either of these cases, I think charter schools are really important because they provide a choice for those families and those situations. Another really great thing about charter schools is it's not just an option. Oftentimes you have innovation and opportunities that would not be available in your locally zoned school. That can look like classical education. It can look like dual immersion, particularly offering languages that wouldn't otherwise be offered. And it can look like some really innovative academic and curriculum approaches. And so for all those things, it's not just a choice for parents, but innovations and opportunities that their children wouldn't otherwise have. And last, kind of that's from the family perspective, which that's good for communities, but thinking through how charter schools really impact communities more broadly. There's a lot of different ways that just having a charter school is really positive. I know the State Charter Schools Commission worked with Georgia State back in, I think, 2017 to look at property values in communities that had charter schools and saw, upwards of 8% property value increases in areas where a charter school had a attendance zone. Around those areas, those property values increased up to 8%. Even in areas where there wasn't a priority attendance zone, you still saw property values in the suburbs increasing anywhere from 2 to 6%. So good for communities, good for families.
Mike, in 2018, House Bill 787 was passed, and that gave state charter schools a huge boost in funding. However, there are still a number of challenges when it comes to equitable funding for charter schools. Why are public charter schools still coming up short in comparison to traditional schools when it comes to funding?
Well, for many years, unfortunately, charter schools were a little bit of the redheaded stepchild in the public education community. Even though they are public schools, we'll talk a little about that a little bit more later. There's a feeling that they're a little different, and when you have a local charter schools, it's really up to the local Board of Education how much they want to fund that charter. And so if they've got budget issues, sometimes it's a little bit easier to let the charter guys kind of suffer on the vine. At the state level, because Georgia funds their education with roughly half state money and half property tax, we have a state chartered school, doesn't have any property tax, and we have to fund that with a supplement. And that's what 781 did. But that puts a big line item in the budget which says state charter school supplement, and it sort of highlights one part of the school, even though you've got a $10 billion line item later for QB where we're funding all the public schools. Because the charter one is kind of held out, it makes it legislatively more of a target and easier to demagogue. And unfortunately, some of the public educator establishments still uses charter schools as a punching bag and uses that as a symbol of trying to just keep things the way they are. So because of that, it creates headwinds. But 71 was a great win, and facilities funding is another challenge, and then we're going to talk about that a little bit later.
And that's actually next on our list.
There you go.
Facilities are one of the largest obstacles to opening and sustaining a charter school. Mike or Hannah, can you just talk about why facilities are such a challenge?
I'll go first. I was actually on the board of Fulton Academy in Science and Technology, a local charter school in Roswell, when we opened it, and we're remodeling a church. And that's with Fulton County, who funds charter schools very well by comparison, and even still, it was unbelievable. We had to have parents helping to actually get the school ready to be opened, and it's an amazing challenge. But again, it goes down to funding. I remember several years ago, Georgia Public Policy Foundation through Kelly pointed out a study where, because of eSPLOS, because of the sales tax we give to education, it only can be used on facilities. So Georgia actually spends more than the national average on facilities per kid, not on operational. But since it's that local sales tax money, again, it doesn't go to charter schools. It certainly doesn't go to state charter schools. So this giant funding source that a regular traditional brick and mortar public school has is not available to charters. So they tend to be very underfunded. And then, by definition, a charter school is a new school, so you're talking about a new building. So it's just a massive challenge and headwind. How do you want to point some more up?
Yeah, so I helped found Westside Atlanta Charter School, and sometimes it's helpful to dig down and see like what it looks like for a particular school. And I will say, is serving on the board there, that has been the thing that we have talked about more than anything else. And you're like, that's a shame. It'd be great if we talked about student outcomes more than anything else, but it takes, all the oxygen in the room. And we started off operating on the ground level. There was a really gracious developer in the area who had built mixed income housing that they were wanting to use part of it for retail that they were never able to sell. So we were able to lease that essentially for free. And that's the only way it was able to make us work, that and modular units. Before there was a Atlanta Public School empty building that we were able to move into. But a lot of districts and in a lot of circumstances, even though the law says that those empty buildings are available for charter schools to use, there's tension there. And so I think that that's one thing that really hits not just the bottom line budgetarily, where it can be anywhere from 12 to 18% of the total budget. In a traditional public school, it's more like 0, maybe up to 6% of their total operating dollar budget. That's a big swing, and when we talk about inequity, that's one of the the major causes of inequity, and also a distraction.
During the last legislative session, charter schools did receive an additional $2 million in state facility grants funding, though. So why is additional funding for facilities still needed?
It's still needed because, again, you're trying to make up for the massive disadvantage where the public school, regular public school, has this eSPLOS funding. And Hannah jogged my memory. The challenge in the charter school space when you're opening the facilities is that there are the companies that do financing for charter schools. And like many, there are a good one of those and there are not so good one of those. And many boards spend a ton of their energy and sometimes get in a facilities contract with a funder who ends up causing problems over the long term. But we're trying to make up that gap. Again, a charter school is a public school, and we are basically funding it now closer to parity, much closer now on operational side, but on funding, on the facility side, they're denied massive access to funding stream that these other guys have. So the $2 million was a step in that direction, but it doesn't come close to closing the gap that's out there. So more is needed.
Georgia started to replicate high-performing charter schools, and Georgia Charter Schools Association is part of that work. Can you talk about the effort statewide to replicate high-performing charter schools?
Sure. And I know that there's states like Florida and others where we see a lot more of that, but in Georgia, we're starting to see there was an incubator at the Georgia Charter Schools Association, which is helping to both create startup charter schools and look at replicating really effective charter programs. And we've seen that in Patala Academy, which is in South Georgia, which is great because I think the movement of having charter options in more rural areas, we've got a lot of growth opportunity in Georgia for that. And so they have now replicated another rural Georgia charter school, which is great. We also see that with several other in the metro area that either are opening up a successful charter school replication or are looking to do that in the next several years. And that's a really encouraging sign, because we know then we have schools with a track record. They've had, demonstrated student success, and we can have those offerings for other schools throughout the state, or other students throughout the state.
Charter schools are held to a high level of accountability in exchange for flexibility and meeting academic performance goals that are set in their charters. However, sometimes there's laws that are passed or policies that are put in place at state and local levels that encroach on that autonomy and flexibility. So how does that encroachment keep some charter schools from performing at optimal levels? Mike or Hannah?
Sure, I'm happy to. So the basic mantra, I think, in charter schools, and you probably hear it or have heard it, is that flexibility or autonomy for accountability. It's kind of the basic agreement with charter schools, that you say, schools, you have autonomy to do this, in the way that you think will both, most meet student needs and outcomes, but we're going to hold you accountable to those student outcomes and what that performance looks like. And when you change that agreement and you start piling on state and local mandates, that becomes increasingly difficult, to achieve the outcomes that were agreed upon.
Yeah, it is a challenge. I think the state is more cognizant of that recently, or trying not to do that and being better. And also the other thing that's kind of made that a little bit better too is that after the Great Recession, the legislature essentially granted a lot of the same flexibility that charters get to the regular public schools in what are now called charter systems, or IA squared, or strategic waiver systems. So, but they also have some accountability contracts, but nothing as stringent as a regular charter school. But you're seeing more of a flexibility mindset. But I still have the Title 20 book sitting on my desk, and it's this thick of laws related to education. So we still create problems.
Bill, sorry.
What I was going to say is that sometimes I think what happens is there are good ideas, then you think, well, sure, charter schools should do those good ideas, but that can keep charter schools from implementing great ideas. And so I think that autonomy is really important.
Okay. Bill, critics often say that they don't support charter schools because they're an effort to privatize public education, and they're run by for-profit operators. What's the reality?
I have to say that I often find this argument somewhat curious, the anxiety about for-profit. And I understand how things could potentially go awry, and I'll address that. But kids, when they get up in the morning and go and get on a school bus, they're getting on a school bus built by a for-profit company that is fueled by gasoline that is made by or provided by a for-profit company. They go to a school where the textbooks that they read out of or use are typically made by for-profit companies, Houghton Mifflin or whomever it may be. They eat lunch in a cafeteria with food that is provided by for-profit companies. And so some of this kind of scary language about for-profit, I have never quite understood. And I think in many ways, yes, what the concern comes from a legitimate desire on the part of parents to be certain that the people that are providing education are in it for the right reason and not there to just simply make a profit. I get that. But to me, the best judge of that, I think, typically, are the parents themselves. And when you see opportunities for parents to easily move students from one school to another when they are dissatisfied, you typically get better schools. And by the way, you also get better parents. And I think this in some ways relates back to the morning conversation that we saw about early childhood. The more and more that parents feel like they have agency, like they have a strong voice, and in a certain sense are going to be held accountable themselves by the decisions that they make, because if their neighbors make better choices than they do, their own kids are going to suffer by comparison. The more that parents have a stake and a voice and power to make decisions, the more they will, I think, on balance, not in every case, but on balance, make better decisions for their kids. And so competition not only gives us better schools, but it actually also gives us better parents.
Hannah, does Georgia have a large number of for-profit charter schools?
No, and I mean, I think if you look at what we have, 115 or so charter schools, and of those, maybe a handful or so have a for-profit connection. Beyond these other connections you mentioned of school buses and textbooks and all those things, but the National Alliance for Charter School Authorizers, NACSA, actually did a study recently looking at Georgia specifically, or they looked at Georgia among 20 or so other states and said that, in fact, we had the highest number of mom and pop sort of startup charter schools where there was grassroots kind of coming from the community, not from either a for-profit or not-for-profit kind of national or other connection. And so I think when you hear that, in addition to all the arguments you raise around the for-profit side, it's also just like the case in Georgia that it's really like a relatively non-issue for us.
And I'll add too that all of our charter schools that are outside of a board have a local board, which is a nonprofit board which governs it, and they may have a for-profit operator, but they're still a quote nonprofit thing that's in the middle of.
Well, not quote. They're
yeah,
under.
Yeah,
they're
it's real
501c3s under federal law.
Exactly. I removed my quote.
Turning back to what critics say, some of those who oppose charter schools say that they're filled with bad actors who don't care about students and want to steal money. Is that the case, Bill?
So, yeah, we hear this a lot in Florida, and quite frankly, we have, bad actors have cropped up from time to time, not just in the charter sector, but lo and behold, in every single sector. And this is the thing that I know personally as the father of 4 children who have made their way through, K through 12 education. And they've done it with our 4, somewhere along the line, we did education just about every way you can do it, okay? We've had exposure to public schools. In fact, all 4 of ours graduated from public high schools, but we've also done magnets and charters and private schools and homeschooling and all kinds of crazy things. So, and here's my observation has been this, that in every single sector you can find some outstanding options, and that we ought not create a environment or have a discussion that insinuates that some modes of education are just off limits, that can't produce good outcomes. But in every sector, you'll also find bad actors from time to time. And in some respects, it reminds me of a little nursery rhyme that I used to read my daughter when she was in that critical 1 through 3 age, or 0 to 3. And it goes something like this. There was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good. But when she was bad, she was horrid. And there's a sense in which that, to me, kind of explains a lot that we see in the schooling. That in every mode, you'll find schools that are very, very good, and you'll occasionally find some that are horrid. And rather than getting into this, I think, counterproductive discussion that says we should only do this or we should only do that, my own bias is to say, no, what we should do is provide options for parents and let them make decisions based on what they have available in their community so that they can find the very best option for their child. And invariably, you will find in a competitive market like that, good options rising to the top and those horrid options becoming fewer and fewer.
This year, there's expected to be a legislative effort to add language to the existing law that clarifies that state charter schools are public schools and should be treated that way for funding, taxation, and for eligibility in the state health benefits plan. These schools are currently receiving public funding and are considered public schools by the state and federal government. So why is this legislation needed, Hannah?
There's a phrase back when I used to be at the Capitol a lot more that I heard a lot, which is belt and suspenders. Oftentimes somebody would say, like, well, we need to confirm that something happens, belt and suspenders. You don't need both, but it's helpful. I would say this is a belt and suspenders and then another belt. And that it's abundantly clear that charter schools are public schools for all the reasons you mentioned and a litany of others that the Attorney General highlighted in a 2017 letter when this kind of conflict came up about could state commission charter schools participate in the state health benefit plan. And all those arguments were really well laid out. It was still kind of raised as a question. Any of you who deal with most of you do, with our state statutes and regulations understand that oftentimes there's one thing in one part of the code that says it in one way and another part of the code that says it in a different way. This is belt, suspenders, and another belt, just to be abundantly clear that they're public schools in that way.
I think it'll be good to have that done in the legislature and in public too, because if I surveyed the members of the General Assembly, I bet you I'd find 10 or 15% who probably weren't sure that a charter school was a public school. So having that just sort of beat over the head of everybody, I think is a great exercise in addition to what Hannah said on the legal side.
And many in our audience are familiar with charter schools, but can you just once again talk about who can attend a charter school and what are the admissions requirements? Hannah.
They're public schools, so anyone can attend them who lives in the area. Just with any public school, there's an attendance zone, and that's the case for some state commission charter schools. There's a statewide attendance zone, and for other locally approved and others, there might be a more narrow attendance zone, but anyone can attend. I have 3 kids that go to a charter school. They, receive gifted services. I have a son who has special needs. He has an IEP, protected by all the, federal regulations and all that. And I think in all those ways, it's helpful to know these are ways that, charter schools are public schools. They're not magnet programs where you have to have an application or any specific requirement to get in.
Turning to the Georgia Special Needs Scholarship, first of all, Hannah, how does the Georgia Special Needs Scholarship currently work, and who's eligible to receive one?
So the Georgia Special Needs Scholarship is oftentimes referred to as the SB 10 waiver. That's how I hear a lot of parents in the community talking about it. And that's because that was the bill back in 2007 that created the program. And this is, one of our longest standing choice programs in the state. And it is a voucher for students who have special needs, who have an IEP in their public school, that are attending public school for at least a year, and they can take the state portion of their funds for education to an approved private school. There's waivers for military dependents and also for some students who have medical needs that aren't able to meet that full 1-year requirement. And the program's grown a lot since 2007, about 4,600 students today.
Advocates are hoping to expand the scholarship in the upcoming legislative session. What could potentially be included in the bill or bills?
Yeah. So I mentioned the 4,600 students. That's maybe about 2% of eligible students in the state currently, if you look at the body of students who have an IEP. And while there are a lot of students like my son, who I mentioned, who's in a charter public school, that are served really well in their public schools, I talk weekly to parents who are frustrated and confused, and the options that they have are not working for their son or daughter. And there's a lot of opportunity that we as a state can do better in serving these families. And so I think that there's opportunity this session to expand eligibility for the program to include students with 504 plans. So if IEPs are one federal designation and way of serving students with disabilities, 504 plans are another. And it would make that easier for students who have special learning differences and needs to be served in the environment that would be best for them if they need that choice. And then I think also right now, K-12, you have to have attended 1 year K-12 to be eligible. And then pushing that down to special needs preschool, so that 1 year and that special needs preschool would also count towards that 1 year public requirement. And then lastly, we have waivers for really important populations like our military dependents, understanding that they have unique needs. Also creating a waiver for students with special needs that are adopted or placed in guardianship from foster care, understanding that those parents need all the tools that they can to help address the needs of their children. So I think that, in addition to some bureaucratic hoops and red tape that we have, and making it more transparent for families, we can do some improvements. The program really hasn't changed much in the now 12 years since its inception, and so there's some opportunity to make that better for families.
Bill, Florida was the model for the establishment of this scholarship, but now Florida has moved past Georgia. So what's Florida doing in this area?
So yes, we adopted something called the McKay Scholarship a number of years ago that provided basically what might be thought of as a one-time voucher for parents, which is to say once a year they get to choose a school if they are not satisfied with the public school that they can send their special needs child to. And that program has worked successfully. It has been quite popular, and the results that we've seen from students have been extraordinary. Our special needs population tests at the very top of the nation compared to other special needs students in other states. And most of these students remain in the public schools. But again, the competition from the private sector, from the private schools, has raised all boats. So McKay has been out there for a number of years, has been successful, but a few years ago, we adopted something called the Gardner Scholarship. It's a education savings account program, which basically allows parents of special needs children the opportunity to have, in effect, the per pupil fund set aside for their child put into an account from which they can then draw to make multiple choices. And so instead of making a one-time choice for a particular school, they can, if they want, patch together an array of options to better serve the unique needs of their special needs child. And so some of them will use their monies to provide tutors or therapy or online programs or other things, and they can, with this education savings account, you get more flexibility, and they can more easily kind of tailor or customize the education to the unique needs of their particular child. That program has also been very successful, wildly popular. I think probably one of the most significant school choice initiatives in our upcoming legislative session will be an expansion of that Gardner Scholarship, and we would certainly encourage other states to follow in that path.
So how have students in Florida benefited from education savings accounts in your mind?
Yeah, so in many ways, we also have, by the way, a reading scholarship that is built on this same education savings account model. And what it does is it provides students in the early grades who are below grade level in reading, because we know how critical reading development is in those K through 3, K through 4 arena. What it does is it provides parents with a $500 amount in an account that they can then use for additional reading services to help raise their child's performance. Some of them use it for after-school programs or tutoring and that sort of thing. Many times students or parents will use these for summer programs that are often run by public school teachers who are looking to make some additional income. It's a kind of win-win in my mind. So we have a reading scholarship that works as well, but the key thing to recognize about both the reading scholarship and the Gardner Scholarship, and this is true really in my mind of all ESA-like programs, is this. With that flexibility, you give parents the opportunity to fashion things to provide the very best fit for their child. And it brings to mind an experience I had a few years ago when I went with my youngest child to a college admissions presentation at a school that he was considering. And the college admissions officer got up in front of the group and he said at the very beginning, the 3 most important letters in the college admission process are not ACT or SAT. The 3 most important letters are FIT. What we are looking for as admissions officers are who are the students that are going to best fit here? And likewise, what you as parents and students should be thinking about is, where will you fit best? And I think that sort of philosophy or that sort of thinking is what ought to govern all of our thinking about education way back into the K through 12 and beyond sort of realm, where we come to the table not saying, is this a good school or not so good school, so much as, is this the right school for my child? Because you can be in a district with a very good school that has very good test scores and very good reputation, but it may not be the right fit for your particular child. I mean, believe it or not, there are students every year who transfer out of Harvard. No one says Harvard's a bad school. It just wasn't the right school for a certain number of kids. We ought to have that same sort of mentality when it comes to education and say, our first priority, as much as we love and care about schools, especially our dear old alma mater, the most important thing about education is not schools, it's students, and helping them define the right fit for each and every one of them.
We just heard about education savings accounts in Florida. So Mike, why are they needed here in Georgia?
I could say what Bill said and save us a little time, but I will point out that, again, we don't have any kind of account in Georgia where parents can make educational choices for their kids. And Bill said it best, it's about the fact that there are a lot of people who would like to choose from a menu of services You know, you have homeschoolers who do this, and maybe two or three times a week they bring in labs and teachers and do things like that, or they have tutors, or they have virtual school, or they just want to take the money and they go to a private school because the public school in their area is, again, not a fit, or is a failing school, or all those different reasons. So we're seeing this as a fact that you're giving the parents the autonomy to make the best decision for their child, because right now the state is making a decision for your child by saying you must attend this school in this zone. And we're saying that the philosophy in ESA is saying that the parent knows best about how to direct dollars to their children. And like Bill will tell you, even with the great program Florida has, the vast majority of kids are still in the traditional public school. And I think there's a fandom fear that all of a sudden this is going to cause everybody to run out of the school. But we really in Georgia, the advocates for ESA, and I've been working on ESAs ever since I was in the House, really want to send the message and to put the money in control of the parents. And when you say the money follows the child, if it follows the child to the parent who can make educational decisions, then that works the best for everybody.
This was one of the Lieutenant Governor's priorities during the last legislative session. Does he plan to support it again? And if so, what might we see in the legislation this year? Or 2020, excuse me.
I will say that there's been continual work, what I will call behind the scenes, this entire off session. That is an incredible political lift in Georgia. It is opposed vehemently by the regular public education folks, even with the we put enormous guardrails in legislation. It was capped a very small percentage of people. We are saying eligible will be kids who are low income based on a percentage of federal poverty level, kids with disabilities and IEPs, so they can, instead of doing SB 10, they could do an education savings account plan. Things like foster kids and military kids. And then if there was money left over in this very small cap program, then it could be maybe eligible for the general education or just the regular student. The problem is even though we keep narrowing down the focus, unfortunately the opponents of this don't really want to let any form of this come out of the legislature, because I think they fear it getting bigger. So it's very hard to negotiate on this because, again, you're negotiating against people who really don't want to have anything happen and aren't really interested in an answer. But that being said, there's an enormous amount of energy going on behind the scenes to see if we can solve for the politics of this. Because, again, we see the Democratic side most times uses this just as a way to paint the Republicans as an enemy of education. Not all, but most of them do that way. And then we have some rural legislators who are more concerned because their rural school superintendents, school boards are telling them this is going to be a drag on their local public schools, which are very important to the local community. So when you have both those headwinds in politics, it makes it tougher. But believe me, we are working very, very hard to see if we can have a solution that we can roll out next year and give it a try again.
Just real quick, so that was back in 2007 when the SB 10 went into place, a lot of these same sky is falling concerns with implementing a program like that were raised. And we now, have 12 years of history to say that they didn't happen. All those horror stories and things saying of like, well, what if, they didn't come to play.
It reminds me also of the horror stories in 2012 with the charter amendment here, that we were going to have this whole charter on every corner, and we were going to cancel art classes and all this sort of horror story stuff in the charter movement. None of that happened either. So the sky's falling is not falling. I preach that all the time, and Hannah's right. SB 10 didn't raise anybody's sky to fall.
Critics have said that education savings accounts take away money from traditional school districts, but a recent study by a senior fellow at the Georgia Public Policy Foundation actually found that there's a cost savings. Mike, can you talk about that study?
Yes, it's a great study, and we've tried to teach legislators this over and over and over again. Here's the way I can illustrate. Let's pretend you just had a school with 1,000 kids, and you spend $10,000 per kid, so you're spending $10 million. And roughly in Georgia, half of that comes from property tax from your local citizens, and half comes from the state. So let's say of my 1,000 kids, 100 go and take an ESA, so they leave the books of the state. So I, as a local school, I don't have to educate them anymore. They've left. So I lose my state money, I lose half my money for the kids. But I keep all the property tax money because that's just something I'm collecting from the county. So essentially, when kids leave a regular public school and take an ESA or take a school choice option, the school keeps all of their property tax money. So they end up having actually more money per child than they would have. They actually get a boost in money per child, which is what the schools are always arguing for, than if these kids had not left in the first place. And the study that you referenced just went through all the math and all the economics and showed that in almost every single school district in Georgia, that marginal cost of that extra student was a savings for the school because they have more money left over.
Hannah, what are the differences between an education savings account and a voucher?
So one of the ways, so as you both have highlighted, an ESA gives parents flexibility. A voucher, it's for private school tuition. An ESA, it could be, so in the case of, I hear this a lot from parents of students with special needs who are asking for an ESA option. And so in that case, what could it mean? It could mean that your child has speech therapy services, individualized curriculum that you can purchase if you're going to be doing education in a hybrid model. It could be virtual education. It could be therapies that they need as part of that, or tutoring. And so, I think that there's a lot of different ways that it can look, but the point is it's a menu of things that you pull together to help make their education what that individual student needs.
Okay. Bill, what's being done in this area in other states?
So there are a number of states that have adopted some form of an ESA, usually for special needs kids, or at least initially for that population, but then it's expanding beyond that in places like Florida and Arizona and Nevada and whatnot. The thing that to me is really interesting about this, and I say this as a good Floridian who actually has a great affection for your state. I'm one of those UGA fans that cheers every year for the Dogs instead of the Gators when you come to Jacksonville, and I'm rooting for you guys to leapfrog us and to do something bolder and more imaginative and better than what we've done in Florida, so that it'll put pressure on our legislators to raise their game as well. And I think there's a real opportunity here for states, especially in the area of economic development. We normally think of education as a way of preparing students for a future workforce, among other things, okay? And that's totally appropriate. But there is a lot of pent-up demand all over the country, in some of your own neighboring states, for school choice. And there is a sense in which, in a mobile economy like we have today, there's a sense in which a state that raises the flag and says, we are going to offer you more options than any place else nearby, is, I suspect, likely to find some South Carolinians or North Carolinians and other people from maybe Illinois or who knows where saying, I want to move to Georgia and set up business there, or to move with my company there and to bring my talent there, as well as my kids, to take advantage of these kind of schooling options. So don't simply think of education as a way of preparing future workforce, as legitimate as that is. Think of this as an economic development opportunity and take use of it.
Some lawmakers are fearful about the political fallout if they support an ESA. Should they be concerned, Bill?
So this is what's really interesting that's happened in our state. I don't know if you guys I know you had a really close and interesting governor's election of your own last year, but our gubernatorial election was fascinating. And I say this as a political independent. I do policy, I don't do politics. But this was fascinating. So we had a very dynamic African-American gubernatorial candidate from the Democratic side. He's the mayor of Tallahassee. I know him personally. He is a political athlete, to the max. Amazing political skills. So he's running as the Democratic candidate and makes the mistake of following the advice of the teachers' unions and criticizing some of our school choice programs. And lo and behold, because we have a school choice community that's very large now, we have 100,000 students who take our low-income scholarship, even more that are in charter schools. That community got activated, and when the election was held, the Republican, Ron DeSantis, who supported the continuation and expansion of school choice, won narrowly, and won thanks to the support from a largely African-American mother population. The statistics on this are really fascinating. He got like 1 out of 5 African-American votes. From African-American women, he got 1 out of 5 votes, which was way more than had historically been true, was way more than was showing up in the Republican column in any other race. And it was all because these moms basically said, look, we'd like to support our brother who's running in the Democratic race, and most of us are card-carrying registered Democrats, but we are not going to let our kids' educations suffer. And they ended up voting Republican. DeSantis wins. With it, he gets new Supreme Court appointments that now tip the balance of our court so that it's more friendly to school choice. He initiates a new expansion of a scholarship program, and away we go. So it's a very interesting political coalition that has been built that brings together a lot of free market conservatives with a lot of lower income African American and Hispanic mothers who say, we want best for our kids.
Okay.
sorry.
I
I was just going to say, that was written up in the Wall Street Journal, and we've passed that around quite a bit with the Republicans in the General Assembly to try to educate them that this is a winning issue across demographics that don't normally vote Republican.
Okay. Just quickly, do we have a few minutes for questions? So Kyle is going to pass around some paper if you want to ask our panelists a question.
Write down on the note cards on the table. Here's the first one.
Okay, I'll go ahead and read this. What is Florida doing to attract charter schools to the state, and is there anything Georgia could replicate? Bill?
Read that first part first.
What is Florida doing to attract charter schools to the state?
So one of the things that we've done most recently is developed a program called Schools of Hope, and it basically says this, that if you live in an area that has a chronically failing school, we will provide charter opportunities to go in and have streamlined the process so that some charter consortiums that have proven results in other states won't have to jump through as many hoops and barrels, but can come and establish new charter schools in those areas. So we've targeted some of these chronically failing areas specifically, and that's something that we have done most recently. But yes, I think that there's certainly opportunity in this area, but in all sorts of other ways. It's not as though charter schools are only beneficial to low-income students. They are often quite appealing to other families. In fact, in Arizona, they have the Great Hearts Foundation that has been producing lots of really impressive results using kind of a classical model. And we, again, have sought to allow for some of those sorts of programs to more easily come to our state, along with providing, and I don't know where how Georgia handles this, but we've also sought to provide a way for the charter approval process for local charters to be able to bypass the school board if the school board is ornery, because that sometimes happens. We have some schools, Miami-Dade is, the superintendent is very friendly to charters, very welcoming, has, I think, the best interests of students first and foremost. But in other parts of our state, we don't get that sort of reception, and we have a way to bypass that and allow for a university review board to assess a charter application and provide certification if need be.
Okay, this person wants to follow up on the first talk, and they said, how about, 0 to 3-year-olds in charter schools? And would it be paid for by the public? And, could it be for the poor and those with special needs? So kind of encompassing everything. Anyone on the panel want to take that?
Wow. I like it. I'm not sure what to say there. The problem is that the state law prescribes what ages you're funding for, and so there would not be a funding stream right now for a 3-year-old charter school. But anyway, it's interesting.
My own take on the earlier presentation, I thought the research there was just dead on, really, really profound, really powerful. My own take is that I think federal policy is probably where we need to focus attention. There's a lot of, our Senator Rubio and a number of others are advocating for paid family leave in some form. He has a proposal that would tie it to Social Security, where you would take time now with your kid, help them get off to a good start, and then in exchange work longer instead of retiring at an earlier age. There are others that are talking about reviving something called the WeTots tax credit. that existed for a brief time before Bill Clinton killed it when he came into office, and it provided basically tax relief to families with newborns or young children, and I think that idea has a lot of promise as well because it strengthens the economic power of families, makes it easier for them to devote time with their children, and that I think was, to me, the kind of take-home from this morning was that kids need someone relationally investing heavily in them.
So you mentioned federal barriers. I know one of the barriers, there are charter schools right now who offer pre-K programs, and Georgia law allows those schools to have that be a preference, so that if you attend the pre-K program, you can then be, guaranteed admission into the kindergarten. Federal law, unfortunately, does not include that as one of the allowable requirements or exceptions for a lottery, and you would not be eligible for certain federal funds if you took advantage of that. So that's a small thing that could change on the federal level that would, I think, incentivize if innovation is what is needed in that birth to 3, anything we can do to reduce the barriers to innovation would be great.
Any other questions? Okay. Seeing none, thank you guys so much. I hope you guys got some good takeaways, and we appreciate the panelists.